Well, hey, Eddie, super excited to have you here today. I know that we connected at a recent Medical Affairs Summit, and I thought you did a really wonderful job of talking about effectively what the future of medical affairs looks like. How do we think about omnichannel? What are the most important metrics that teams of the future, as they think about the next couple of years, really need to focus on? So I would love to, before we get into this really exciting topic, for you to maybe share a little bit of your background.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, excited to be here, Vera, as well, and looking forward to having our chat today. Eddie Power, I'm the CEO of Empower Medical, which is a consultancy specializing in medical affairs and looking at everything from organizational design to medical strategy to launch excellence. And as you were touching on, also harnessing advanced analytics and some of these new tools like artificial intelligence to really enhance medical performance. 25 years in the pharma industry. I've worked all across the globe. I started in working Middle East and Africa and then moved across different regions, had global roles. And most recently, I was VP of North America at Pfizer. So quite a varied career. Interesting to cross all those geographies, all those cultures, get all those different perspectives. But it's been a great learning for me.
That's super exciting. Thank you for sharing. I feel like you have a very impressive array of, to your experience and perspective. So I'm really excited to dig in with you on this whole topic of how has medical affairs evolved, right? As a function over the 25 years that you've seen it, how does it differ across various regions, et cetera? So with that, I would be curious to hear your perspective of kind of what does the maybe give us a little bit of a history of the medical affairs function. Where was it 5 to 10 years ago? Where is it today? And what are the major shifts that are happening that the medical affairs teams of the future need to consider?
What many people don't realize is that the first medical science liaison function was birthed in 1967 by
Yes.
Upjohn. And it actually came out of the sales organization where they felt that there was a need to have more peer experts talking to healthcare professionals. And they took out some sales reps who had more of that scientific, clinical mindset and put them in the field. And they actually had three different groups. They had one group that focused on clinical and scientific exchange and communication. The second group, which I always find fascinating, was focused on adult learning and how
Mm,
best to communicate and educate in a way that adults would assimilate information, which is really the genesis of everything that medical affairs does, right? And purports to do. And the third group was more like a management operations role, really trying to get at the efficacy and try and put measures of outcomes in place. But of course, medical affairs over those 25 years has really transformed from being a supporting function more than anything. Commercial normally took the lead, or R&D took the lead with their clinical studies, but it's really grown into its own. And now you hear some phrases like being the third strategic pillar alongside commercial and
right.
R&D. You're seeing much more investment from companies in the medical affairs function. And with that, of course, comes increased accountability. And
Right.
I think, we're moving in the past where you could say, well, I've got great relationship with a key opinion leader or, Dr. X or Professor Y, to now what's the purpose of having those engagements and why do I have this relationship, or should I be looking at different types of engagements or interactions? So certainly huge transformation over those 25 years, but a really exciting one. I think there's so much opportunity, to embrace. There certainly will be barriers and challenges, but I've always been of the mindset that those are there to be removed. And, with some of these new technologies and approaches like yours, Vera, I think the world is medical affairs oyster, to coin a phrase.
Yes, it is. It truly is. I think to your point, it is so fascinating to really learn about the evolution of the medical affairs function, how it came from the commercial side, but then also outside of that, the role that you highlighted around having a whole separate sub-function in medical affairs that purely tries to learn about how to best communicate and how do people learn the best. I mean, the FDA actually, in a lot of ways does that with a lot of their
Mhm.
guidance letters when it comes to promotional review. They will oftentimes pull in research around how consumers best absorb information or learn, and they try to incorporate that into guidances the best that they can. So in a lot of ways, it sounds, at least in the past, that there was a function similar to that of really understanding how do HCPs understand best, and then how do we communicate that so they do. With that, I'm curious, on the evolving role of medical affairs. How was medical affairs kind of performance measured historically? I know you touched on that a little bit with my relationships with my KOLs are great versus now with the rising investment into the medical affairs function. What is leadership looking for? Like how, do you have a sense of how companies are looking at evaluating the medical affairs function?
I think in the past, many of the metrics that were used were very operational and
Hmm.
more based on efficiency rather than outcome and impact. So, if you run MSL, you had maybe a certain number of engagements that you had to fulfill every month or every year. You had a cohort of healthcare professionals that you interacted with over the course of that year, um, which is fine, but it doesn't really tell you if what you're doing is actually moving the needle or having any meaningful impact or change, in any type of behavior. Um, I think that's started to move more. We've seen the introduction of things like customer satisfaction questionnaires or surveys that
Mm.
really get at, was that interaction meaningful? Did it help me in my decision making? And questions of that ilk. But I think increasingly, with advanced analytics in particular, we're starting to be able to get a closer lens at things like unmet medical need. And that could be,
Mm.
delaying diagnosis. It could be a gap between diagnosis and treatment. It could be adherence to treatment. And you can start measuring the impact of your interactions or your communications or your engagement on those gaps. And are you having any impact or are you having any influence? And it may not necessarily be a direct cause and effect that you can put your finger on, but if
Right.
there's no change, you know that whatever you're doing isn't working. And
Right.
maybe and maybe it's time then for a change or to take a step back and revisit your strategy or revisit, am I talking to the right people? Because at the end of the day, we should all be focused on the same goal, which is whatever we do should be for better patient outcomes, right, and better patient management. And the more that we can keep that focus in mind, I think the better we will get at measuring what's truly meaningful.
Got it. And kind of what I'm hearing from what you're saying is, in the past and also today, and there is certainly value in measuring process-oriented metrics because they are in a way required to get to an outcome. But historically, the measurement was really around the process, right? So number of KOL engagements, maybe number of publications, number of ad boards, with those types of metrics. But what's happening now and what you're starting to really dig into is how do we put the patient at the forefront. I know patient centricity is this hot word, just like insights is. It's just of the month or of the year when it comes to medical affairs, but it truly is the goal of medical affairs is how do we impact the end-to-end patient journey, which is so complex. And there is many stakeholders that are now more involved in that process. So I'm actually curious because I know we've talked about this in the past, and I thought you had a really great way of describing this. But how has that patient stakeholder ecosystem evolved? Um, Also, it sounds like it's gotten more complex, which makes the medical affairs job more complex. Also, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a great question. It's something that I think sometimes we tend to forget in a way. I mean, I always think that in medical affairs, we're not directly interacting with a patient on a clinical basis. We're always working through some stakeholder, and therefore, the closer that stakeholder is to the patient, I think the more effective and impactful medical affairs can be. So if you look at medical affairs a few years ago, and maybe still to an extent today, much of the focus on interaction was with those physicians or healthcare professionals who I think of as more academic. So they were the ones who had a strong publication record, or presented at congresses,
Right.
or had participated in some kind of advisory board, or were perhaps involved with guidelines. But often those, because of their experience and their expertise, are further removed from the patient.
Right.
But today, right, with all these databases and with all these analytics that we can apply to things like diagnostic codes, claims codes, we can really identify those healthcare professionals that are actually touching the patient clinically. And
Right.
they may be people who never go to a congress or never publish. And they were always outside of that kind of medical affairs screening that used to take place. But today we can actually get to those healthcare professionals, and we can be that much closer to the actual impact on the patient through them, rather than somebody who's at a different stage in their career, where they may be a head of department but have fewer right clinical interactions.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's almost like the research influence, so to speak, or whether someone continuously publishes studies or continuously publishes publications does not necessarily equate to them being the closest to the patient and actually seeing what's happening on the ground with the patient, which is such valuable feedback to know for medical affairs function, whether it's to update communications material, whether it's to target different types of physicians or stakeholders, whether it's to go back to R&D because of the feedback that they're getting from doctors that have direct communication with the patient or impact on the patient. So I'm curious, with this kind of, let's call it uh, two bucket or two themed bucketing of physicians, where one is perhaps more research oriented and then one is more community oriented. How do you look at determining how to prioritize these two types of KOLs? Like, when is it good to engage with a research-based one versus when is it good to engage with more of a community-based one?
I like to think of it as part of the life cycle of a particular medicine, or a device, right, or a
Mm,
vaccine, where those that are more research oriented, you probably bring in when you've got a drug in the pipeline that's coming up towards approval and then potentially launch, because they have that experience and expertise and can advise, potentially, well, this mechanism of action really makes sense, or you've got to think of this in terms of what else is out there on the market. And then as you move through that life cycle and you have your medicine approved and then actually being used, that's where to me, that second bucket of healthcare professionals starts becoming more important, because they can give you that real world feedback of what
Yes.
works and what doesn't. And I always think of it as applied medical affairs, because some of
Mm,
the things you may get back may have no relation, right, to the way the drug works. And if you've got something that you use in infusion, they may be more of a concern about compatibility with the infusion pump and how to program it. Or if
right.
you're an infusion nurse, what size gauge needle should I be using? And if you're thinking about an infusion clinic, what's your patient turnover by time, right? So if you turn over patients every 30 minutes, putting something in that takes an hour to infuse may not work. But it's
Right.
it's critical feedback to then, as you say, either take back and look at your medical strategy or even commercial strategy, and even to go back to R&D and say, hey, here are the challenges that we're seeing. Why don't we think of a next generation medicine or next generation device, right, that actually addresses some of that feedback or those insights that we're getting.
Right. Got it. What's really interesting, and if I may add to that, around coming from a more tech perspective in a lot of ways, where I see parallels is that if I'm building a software product, right? Any product, if I'm building ChatGPT to release out into the wild, there's a stage of product building, right? Like someone at OpenAI is training the models, they're coding up the chat UX, right? Before it gets launched. So that's effectively like the R&D element of the medical affairs role, where you might consult a research type KOL to get feedback on the more scientific technical details. So it's similar in tech where you're training an AI model. So maybe you want to go to another AI expert who has a particular specialization, and you want to get their perspective on how you're preventing bias in your model training. Versus, I've now launched ChatGPT out in the wild, and users are giving me feedback, right? They're like, I hate this, I like this. I don't use it because it's not convenient, because the formulation's not formulation in my software is not right. So that's very different, right? I take that and then I use that to make the product more accessible. And that's kind of in a perhaps a funny way, the parallel of applied medical affairs of like the real world and what's the feedback we're getting there versus like the R&D, up to phase 3, right? Like pre-commercialization, more research oriented KOL feedback.
Absolutely. And I think with that research angle, right, it's critical as well, because the one thing in the pharma industry that may be unique, maybe the same in the food industry, is first do no harm, right? So that
Mm.
safety piece in that R&D timeline and process is so critical, right? And then as once you're confident that you can get past that safety parameter, then you can go onto the market and then get some more of that real world feedback.
Yeah, absolutely, around the safety profiles and also what impacts that perhaps too. Like what elements of, is it the mechanism of action? Is it the way that it's administered that ultimately impacts the safety profile or the efficacy or the combination? And what's interesting as well, though, I'll add to this is I have been talking to clinical development functions as well, and part of their role, right, is also understanding in the earlier stages of R&D and development, what is the therapeutic landscape? What are the
Mm.
different potential opportunities for unmet medical needs that we can go and address? So medical affairs, in gathering this applied real world data, so to speak, on certain characteristics of a drug that's out in market can help funnel back to R&D roles, clinical development roles, so they can make even better and more informed decisions around what drugs do we develop that then better fit the end patient 5 to 10 years from the time it starts.
Yes, they're absolutely right.
So how do you now maybe let's get into the tactics of, we all know medical affairs would love to measure impact and outcomes. So how do we actually do it? Because it seems like, this concept of insights is this kind of nebulous hot topic that everyone talks about. So if you're entering a medical affairs team today and you are like, okay, we're going to map out how we're going to measure impact, what would be your plan?
Yeah, so for me today, I would start from the analytics side, so from that patient interface and kind of work backwards, right? And we talk about the traditional key opinion leader pyramid, right, where you have your top opinion leaders at the apex of the triangle and then move down. And here, I think, Vera, what we're talking about is actually inverting that triangle, and you start
Yes.
putting it upside down, and you start with the base. And if you take one of those unmet medical needs, say adherence to treatment, that's discordant with guidelines. That's a great starting point because you can measure that, and you can measure an impact with what you do if you take that as a starting point. And then you can harness and focus all your medical efforts on that. You can identify the HCPs who are treating patients according to guidelines or not, and both are equally important sources of feedback and
Right.
insights, right? And then you can use all your different resources. You can have your MSLs very focused in their areas on both of those groups of HCPs who are managing patients on a daily basis, while the ones who are adhering to guidelines doing so, and is there anything there that any insights that can be translated to those that don't, and vice versa, right? It can work both ways. But then you can also start layering on your other resources like social media communications or medical website communications, because your MSL is a finite resource,
Right.
um, and you can only deploy so many in a cost-effective manner. But you still probably only scratch the surface of the number of practicing HCPs for a particular condition or disease state. But you can start using those other resources to focus and engage with other types of HCP, those who may not manage a large number of patients, those who may prefer to communicate via
Right.
social media or self-serve through a website. Some may still prefer email or phone call, but it just starts giving you a much broader landscape, right, and a much broader starting point. If you start with that question or that gap in patient care or patient management. And medical, by the way, Vera, I know some of the concern as well. We can't use any prescription data, but you can if you bucket things therapeutically, and it's agnostic,
Interesting.
right, of a
Right.
of a particular drug or device, right, or a vaccine. If you've got disease X and treatment options are A, B, C, you can bucket those treatment options. And then as a medical organization, you're truly focusing on the unmet medical need.
So it sounds like from like a tactical execution standpoint, if you're a medical affairs team, the first number one thing to potentially focus on is what is the standard of care or perhaps the treatment guidelines for your specific indication or disease state, and work with therapeutically aggregated claims and diagnostics data, which is compliant. And analyze the data to see if there's gaps in what you're seeing at an aggregate level with claims and diagnostics to the standard of care. And that, if you see anything there, that's the kind of the golden nugget of impact that you can now set as a goal to reduce or close. And then you can also measure over time whether you've made that impact because you have the claims and diagnostics data.
That's correct, and it's a very powerful tool both externally and internally once you have those impact data. Right, internally you can justify and even ask potentially for more resources, but
Right.
you're showing your impact internally with senior leadership. But externally, it's actually a value add service or communication that you can take back to those healthcare professionals or to institutions and say, hey, have you realized that there's a discordance here with guidelines, or we can connect you with this other institution that actually does things concordant with guidelines, and here's how they do it.
Right.
So you start with a value, but then that value in itself leads to further elements and layers of value, if you like, that really focuses on the impact and the outcomes from a patient first perspective.
And it sounds like what I'm also kind of hearing out of this incentive alignment is that once you align with the patient and what's best for them, you're also, in theory, aligning with the incentives of all of the middle stakeholders that are between you and the patient, because the hospital system also wants to service the patient with the proper, most optimal standard of care, because it could be cheaper for them to do it more efficiently because they're doing it really well, right? So now you, as the pharmaceutical or the med device company, are coming to these stakeholders with an insight that's really valuable to them. So what if you could be in a world where, rather than you having to seek out KOLs, they actually came to you because you provided so much value, and started to build that trusting relationship. So that's also kind of what I'm getting as a side effect, so to speak, of focusing on the patient at the center.
Absolutely, it's a real like win-win all the way around, right? It's meant to be a two-way or maybe multiple way of engaging and exchanging information or data, right? Insights that can really have an impact on overall patient management and outcomes.
Right.
And sometimes I mean, it's not also to throw the baby out with the bathwater either, right? That sometimes there may be gaps or areas that you already know from your clinical development program.
Mm,
There's certain patient populations that weren't covered in our clinical studies, or whether there's certain safety signals that we want to keep an eye on, or other drug interactions that may be important uh, that come outside of your clinical development program. But again, those things you can measure as well potentially with analytics, rather than just
right.
having an anecdotal um, approach, right? And with whom to engage with, because you can identify, say, if there's patient populations that are missing, with analytics, you can focus on those healthcare professionals or institutions that focus on those patient populations. So again, it's bringing that kind of win-win mentality with a patient at the forefront of it all.
Right. Versus the KOL relationship being the forefront. It's now the future of medical affairs is putting that patient journey at the forefront, and the KOL relationships, but those being in alignment with the patient journey.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And of course, I mean, relationships are always going to be important in whatever walk of life, right? It could be
Right.
like that with an opinion leader, but it's same with business, right? Where if you have a connection or a relationship with somebody, it often leads to better business interactions.
Right.
The same in our personal lives, right? With family or friends. So there's an important component there. But I think, as you rightly said, that shouldn't be the driver necessarily
Right.
of the
A
of the
patient
program, right? Of
impact.
the impact, exactly.
Right. That makes sense. And I guess, with that, now that we've established patient centricity, and one of the ways to measure patient centricity is through aggregated slash therapeutically aggregated claims and diagnostics data, let's call it. That's one big bucket. So now we've established that. And now we're tactically executing on achieving or closing this gap. Well, a big part, I think, of being able to know, right, whether you're heading in the right direction is you have to be able to measure and see what's happening in real time across all of your efforts. So I would love to dig into that a little bit. And I'm curious how you think about gathering data across all of the different channels that you have as a medical affairs team and how to think about interpreting the signal through the noise, right? Of, hey, I have this MSL who came back to me and was like, Dr. Alex is really concerned about this population and the contraindications of this drug in this population. How do you know that that note is, what if it's a one off? What if this HCP, they have a certain type of perspective. So when you put it in context, this note, it's just particular to that HCP versus like, oh, this is something that is a broader challenge that we should actually invest resources into addressing.
I think that's where you can start bringing in and really leveraging all your different sources of information or observations, right? And really turn them into insights. Because, you've got your MSLs, as you were articulating, very well, saying, okay, I've talked to Professor X, and here's the information or insight that she gave me. But you're right, is that just one data? It's just one data point. But then you
Right.
start pulling in with advanced analytics, your claims data, right? Your diagnostic data, ICD codes, whatever you've got access to. So that's a second bucket of validation. You've got your social media, right? Whether it be
Right.
um, a company like Twitter handle or X handle, or whether it be something that's more on the professional side of things like Sermo, right, or Doximity. Um,
Mm,
which are also different sources of data. You can look at your website information, right, and metrics. And the challenge has always been to pull all of those together into something holistic that helps validate some of those insights or observations that an MSL, for example, brings back. And the challenge
right.
always been, at least when I was the recipient of the information, it was in essence a slide deck with each slide just talking about one of those channels, right? There was a slide on MSL insights, there was a slide on social media insights, there was a slide on website metrics, there was a slide on medical information and what queries they were getting in, and what the trends were looking at. But it was very hard to coordinate and piece together and connect all those dots into something that was a coherent narrative. And
Right.
to translate that into a narrative that tells you, here are the trending issues or observations, and here are the insights that we're getting out of those. So now we can begin to take action. And I also think, Vera, that there's a point in time where some of those social media channels also start giving you the patient feedback.
Mm,
There's kind of a patient sentiment. I always like to use the analogy, right, that all these stakeholders may have different goals,
right.
right? So if you're a patient with, say, high cholesterol levels, the treating physician's goal may be to lower that cholesterol level.
Right.
The patient's goal may actually be to have levels low enough that they can have another cheeseburger.
Right.
Right? They're completely different. But as soon as you start putting all of these different sources of information and insights together, you can start getting a true holistic picture and understand, right, what the pain points are or where potential action points are. And that's, I think, where some of these newer technologies like yours have so much potential, right? And really bring all of that together and harness all those insights into something that's a meaningful and coherent narrative that then can also be more personalized to each of those stakeholders.
Right. Yeah, and I feel like, to what you said, when you're getting N of 1 insight, or maybe it's N of 10, but it's in one channel, it's N of 1 in the channel, it
That
becomes hard and very manual to interpret the signal through the noise. So can I validate effectively this DFO, data factor observation, that I've now seen? Can I validate it with more statistically significant, so to speak, data points? And the challenge of what I hear today, and that you've touched on, is the fact that this process oftentimes is manual, right? You have different data silos. You might have someone go through all the MSL notes, categorize them. You might pull your web stats, your social stats. You'll pull your med info, call center stats. It keeps doing that, and I don't know where, because I'm not on Zoom. So I don't know if it's like a Mac thing, that does that. But anyway,
thing.
so I think one of the challenges, right, of this data is that it's in silos. It's very manual to piece together. And even if you have pieced it together right into a slide deck, one, it's static. So you don't see correlations between the channels. By the time that that deck is put together, those insights and trends might already be outdated, right?
That,
And they might not even be relevant. I mean, imagine doing this during COVID, right? When things would change every single week. If you were able to get insights every single week, that's great. But like, if it took you 4 weeks to be able to compile this deck, you're probably already like it's not useful at that point.
that's absolutely right. And I think, Vera, that's also a critical point that you bring up, that the more we can get towards real-time data and analyses, I think the more effective and the better it makes us. And I always look at sports as really being a leader in that sense.
Hmm.
Like, if you take
Interesting.
an NBA basketball team, you've got potentially sensors on the players themselves, you've got, video being taken, you've got all these coaches on their iPads or laptops, right? But by the next game, they've already analyzed everything and they've
Right.
reconfigured the strategy, right, if they need to. And that game can sometimes be the very next day. And
Right.
imagine if we could be doing that, and how impactful that would be for patient outcomes, right? That you could say, hey, this is working, or, there's this, signal that's coming up, or there's some gap. And you can start harnessing and analyzing all those different sources of information,
Right.
and have something that you can action on. A day may be too ambitious, right? In the medical, but certainly it's going to be more than we're reviewing things every month in a static manner, and how we're going to change things.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I feel like the sports analogy is super, it's a good one. It's a easy one to be able to really relate to. And in a lot of ways as well, if I take an analog outside of pharmaceuticals, like coming from tech, for example, there is, with tech, because they generally tend to be more digital channel type of products. So that's the way that you would really communicate, right? A piece of software, but you're kind of continuously continuously listening to customer feedback. It could be, for example, if I'm a brand, a food brand, I might sell on Amazon. I might have, or maybe I'm a restaurant, I might be on TripAdvisor and I'm on Yelp. That
Right.
customer feedback, those reviews that people are posting, it's really critical feedback for me to monitor. And the more real time I'm also able to get that feedback and pick up on trends, the better it is for me. Because, God forbid, what if something happened that's bad? And now it's, picking up steam on Yelp or TripAdvisor. If I'm able to capture that, if I'm checking insights once a month, like, it's too late. That in the consumer world, it is too late. You cannot do, like, you are gone. So,
Absolutely.
um, I think, to your point, the future of medical affairs is really exciting when we think about the fact of, one, how do we measure metrics around patient centricity? So how do we put the patient at the forefront and create actual numerical measures to measure that impact there? And then two, the second step is, okay, we figured out our North Star, that the gap we want to close. Now we're tactically executing to close that gap, and it's dynamic. The execution, there's things evolving. So how are we continuously monitoring that evolution so we're able to close that gap a lot faster? And that sort of creates this feedback loop. So now we've closed that gap. What's the next gap that we can go to, right?
Well, that's right. And I think that feedback, the more real time it is, also tells you, right, if you're engaging effectively or not. You can,
Mm,
whether it's through social media or whether it's through a website, you can look at which materials are being accessed, right, or downloaded. You don't have to over engineer it, right? It can be simple as having like a thumbs up or thumbs down sign that people can click on.
right.
And
For
you
feedback,
can
right?
take that information, right? You don't have to be, like often say, right? Perfect is sometimes the enemy of the good.
Right. Yes.
Or the you
Done is better than perfect, as they say.
take what you have, right, and take that information that you can glean and action on it, right,
Right.
in as quickly as you can. But it also starts telling you what's resonating, right, and
Mm,
starts bubbling up. What's the information that the healthcare community or the patient community really wants to hear, or really needs to hear, or may not want to hear, right? And then that starts allowing you to to look at your strategy, to look at what you're communicating. It may even lead you to try and generate newer real world evidence that these
right.
days you can also do pretty quickly with advanced analytics through these databases.
Right. And this also, it sounds like, leads to omnichannel, which is another a kind of a topic that's been very hot when it comes to medical. Commercial has their definition, right, of omnichannel, but with, tying it back to actually full circle to the beginning of the conversation when you were talking about how the role of the MSL, one of those sub roles of the MSL was someone who really learned about how to communicate the best. Like, how do people learn? And in a lot of ways, a way to look at that is personalization, because if you're able to personalize it to that HCP, to that stakeholder, they're going to learn better because it's personalized. So I feel like that sub role almost has evolved into, in a way, this concept of medical omni-channel. And the other thing I wanted to kind of mention here, where data can really help with that element, is that once you start to gather this real time data across these different sources, you could also start to put together what I would call segmentation, or a behavioral segmentation of your different stakeholders. And the reason why that's important or helpful is that you can then start to target education and messaging in a way that's relevant to that segment. Maybe you have behavioral segments where certain HCPs care about safety more, or maybe certain HCPs care about a therapeutic area or a certain study population. So now you can start seeing within your universe across digital and offline channels, what are the different segments that treat our patients, and how do we now start personalizing med comms or even med info, depending, to better service those different segments. But you can't get there without analytics. Like, that is the way to be able to segment those and enable omnichannel for medical. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on omnichannel.
No, absolutely right, and I think you've framed it very well. If you just take the medical piece, right? You've got your MSLs, you've got medical information, you've got a
Right,
website, you've got social media. There may be other avenues, right? That advisory boards, it could be congresses, it could be publications, albeit those tend to have a time lag
right,
to them. But as you start aggregating the information, personalizing it, as you say, then it starts becoming much more tailored and personalized to individual needs. And
right,
a prescriber may have a need for very different information. If they're a primary care physician and
right,
they've already got a patient on other drugs, they may want to know, is this safe?
right,
With everything else that the patient has, that the pharmacist may be interested in drug interactions or the infusion pump that we talked about if it's an intravenous drug. The nurse may be on the lookout for potential side effects and how to manage them, because he or she are likely going to be the ones most in contact with a patient.
right,
So as you start getting all this information back, then you can start passing it out and really tailoring that message. And that's just an example on the medical side, but I truly think that pharma as a whole is missing an opportunity, because at the front end, for compliance reasons, um, legal reasons, whatever it is, you can have your separate medical commercial strategies and approaches, and that planning can absolutely be done separately
right,
and with the appropriate firewalls in place. But at the back end, there's no reason why you can't start connecting, those dots, because those insights may sometimes not be necessarily a clinical or a medical reason why something's being done or isn't being done. It could be
right,
something to do with reimbursement.
right.
It
Yep.
could be something to do with a pair or coverage, in that insurance. It could be something that isn't on a particular formulary for some kind of integrated delivery network.
Right,
But at the back end, that really starts pulling everything together, and then it can go back out to the relevant functions, right? The commercial team can then go out and say, okay, we need to address some issue here with coding, and it's impacting
right.
insurance or Medicaid. And if it's a medical issue, of course, it goes back to the medical team. It could be a product quality issue, right? That then goes back to manufacturing,
Right. I
right?
mean, there's
So
so much. Oh, go ahead.
yeah, no, exactly. There's so much, and there's so much potential, right, by using these analytics and AI approaches that are so hard to do manually, and they're all in different silos. And the larger the company,
The more the more siloed it is.
right, that's exactly right.
It's an interesting point that you bring up, because ultimately, even when I zoom out as someone that has not been in pharma for 25 years, and comes with a more technical, I guess, oriented perspective, and what I've seen in my career is that ultimately, in the whole like product development cycle, right, from our preclinical to R&D to commercialization, and continued iterations or innovations of that product, the goal across all of those functions is in theory all the same, which is
That,
how do we address the unmet medical need? Because if you do that, then naturally the right patients are going to get your drug through the right HCPs at the right time, right? And they're going to get treated with the best standard of care. And if that's true, like if that hypothesis is true, that is the goal overarchingly at a high level across all functions, then in theory, all of that data is helpful for everyone, right? I mean,
Uh,
this is why, in with clinical development, the data medical affairs sees is also very helpful for clinical development, as
that's
much
right.
as the clinical development data can also be helpful for medical affairs in educating HCPs, for example, right? Or whoever else is involved in that equation.
Absolutely, because there may be some reasons why, for example, only certain patient populations were included in some clinical trials.
Mhm.
Maybe for valid clinical and scientific reasons, and clinical development absolutely there has a role in saying to medical affairs, hey, here's why. And
Right.
when you're out there having interactions, if those questions come up, now you know exactly why. But
Right.
it adds right. It adds right to that dialogue, and even in early stages in formulation in technology, is that pill too big for somebody who's older to easily swallow, as an
Mm,
right, or somebody who's too young, and instead of having a tablet, do we think of a liquid um, formulation instead? Or with vaccines now, you have some of those flu vaccines that are administered through nasal spray, as an example.
mm,
So, it's you're absolutely right. It's that continuum, and it's a connected feedback loop, and the healthcare professionals, patients, and even increasingly, right, the regulators and payers are all part of that. They're
right.
all part of that feedback loop. We often focus just on that part of the loop where there's been a decision to intervene on a patient, right? Whether it be medically or surgically or whatever it is. But we
Right.
forget that whole ecosystem that's out there.
Yeah. Would you like to touch on this slide?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great visual, right? From a patient perspective, all the different channels that he or she or their caregiver experiences, and we often forget that. There's that HCP interaction.
Right.
First it's diagnosis, and then if it leads to treatment, then part of it goes to the insurers, and they'll get an email saying, hey, your claim is being processed, or then you get another one from them saying, your benefits are in accordance. So on the other side, if you get a prescription, then there's the pharmacy, and you probably get a call or a text these days from your pharmacy saying, hey, your prescription's ready.
Right.
And the pharmacy as well, often when you pick up that prescription, they'll likely know if you're on other medications, because
Right.
most patients tend to use the same pharmacy. And they will often give you personalized advice, right? Because they can see everything that you've been prescribed. But then both of those feed back, to the HCP, right? That A, the prescription's been authorized by the payer, B, that the prescription's been dispensed, by the pharmacy.
Mm,
Uh, but it all starts connecting, right? All those dots, and from the patient, and this is simplified, right? But there's already three different channels, if you like, and
right.
and and then sub channels within those that pair the HCP and the pharmacy that are coordinating, to provide a seamless and very personalized experience. And
Right.
right, and if we can keep this picture in mind as medical affairs, I think the more effective and more impactful it makes us.
Right. And this also all goes to the patient really being at the center. But I think this picture as simplified in a way as it might be, already starts to paint the complexity and of how fragmented the patient journey is in terms of how many people they have to touch to be able to get their treatment. And then on the flip side, as medical affairs, I feel like it's a challenging job that medical affairs has, which is you're not directly in communication with the patient, and you effectively have to influence one of 100 stakeholders along the path that this patient has to go on. I mean, that's like an ultra tough job. This is
That's
why the analytics matters, because you need to prioritize effectively. This is why the communication personalization matters, because you need to know how to reach these different stakeholders with the most effective messaging, all to ultimately create a smooth and seamless patient outcome, or the best possible patient outcome.
absolutely. And then Vera as well, let's not forget that the patient, right, is also part of that feedback loop. And it
Right.
and it
Yes.
works back the other way, right? The patient may say, hey, this medicine's not having any effect on me. Can we try a new one, right? And the
Right.
HCP may say, sure, let's try it. And it may go back to the pair, because often there's a tiering there, or a step edit, or a pre-authorization, or sometimes you have to try
Mm,
medicine A before they will allow, or they will reimburse for medicine B.
right.
Um, so that patient feedback, right, is also part of that loop, and back through the ACP, through to the pair again, and through to the pharmacy again.
Got it. Right. It's a very complex web for sure that I feel like medical affairs is tasked with to make an impact in. So a lot of respect for the role.
Yeah,
I'm
and
curious. Yeah.
it also, Vera, I was going to say, it also, like you had mentioned earlier, it paints the picture that it's also dynamic, right? And it's not
Yes.
static. And
Yeah.
if you're getting a change in medication, you really want to know that as soon as you can, right?
Right.
Rather than when you're looking at the data a month later.
Yes. I mean,
Because
also,
how many patient lives may already have been impacted during that month,
right.
right? Either positively or negatively. Was positively, you can use that information to help
Others be
others,
positively
right?
impacted
Yep,
faster.
and if it's exactly, and if it's negative, it's works the other way too, but it's still for patient
Right.
benefit at the end of the day.
That's a really great point, and I think especially with other stakeholders as well being involved in the equation, whether there's policy changes, whether there's medical guideline changes, whether there's patient advocacy groups
So,
are changing something. All of those external elements are also really dynamic and important to be aware of, to know how to act on it, whether it's good so you can be more in service of the patients, or bad so you can learn and then address it as quickly as you can. So I'm curious now, with this whole discussion, right, of how do we measure truly the impact? As you know, this process is really manual, looking at different sources, whether it's external, internal, quantitative, qualitative, like the MSL notes. How do you see technology, whether it's Gen AI or just automation, like just tech in general, play a part in really enabling the medical affairs function to be the most effective they can be for the patient?
yes, I think we can just use Gen AI, right, as an example, or as a case study. I mean, the first piece is simply just being able to harness, right, and synthesize all those data and insights from all those disparate sources, pull it together in something that's more holistic and has a coherent whole. But with that, it also starts telling you what's being impactful and what isn't, right? Or may not, or may need changing. But it also starts, I think, giving you much more insight into any key trends that are happening.
Mm,
And particularly if it's a model that can self-learn as well, for me, there's also a huge opportunity in being able to be more predictive and more
Mm-hmm.
deliberate about how medical affairs is functioning and engaging. And it could be predictive in the sense of being able to identify trends around the medicines that are being used or being prescribed, and where some of the
Mm,
pain may be, where some of the opportunities may be. It could be trends around which types of specialties of healthcare practitioners, really embracing, right, those
mm-hmm.
medicine. Could be trends around how patients, right, are perceiving those medicines, because it's not, sometimes I think in the medical sphere we focus almost exclusively on efficacy and safety and curing a patient, but there's an emotional element, as
Right.
any patient with whatever disease they have experiences. And it's not just necessarily about getting a cure. It could be more about quality of life, as an
Right.
example. Or it could be about enjoying quality time with the family or whatever it is. But when you start folding that into that mix, I think that's where these technologies are so powerful and give us so much more opportunity to really be effective as a medical affairs organization.
It sounds like it almost it lets you spend more time on being able to dig into patterns or see correlations between whether it's quality of life or different HCP segments versus having to spend time in the weeds of compiling the data or like looking at static reports, which in all of that takes up so much time that you might not even have time to think about correlations or how are trends related to each other. Are there like gaps that I'm not seeing, but predictive and AI can basically go through and show me that this is an emerging correlation that's happening that I should watch out for. And to add to that, like what I'll say is, I know AI, just like insights, I feel like is this overused term that buckets a lot of things under it. So people use AI and they'll mean just software, or they'll use AI and they'll actually
Mm.
mean AI, or they'll use AI and they mean NLP, etc. And what I find interesting around the latest wave of the subset of AI or generative AI, which is based on the what's called the transformer model, but LLMs or large language models are one subset of generative AI. And
Right.
where I think those are really interesting in terms of analysis is because large language models are trained on text and language, it is their specialty to analyze that. So similar to NLP, it's basically like NLP 2.0 on steroids, where now we can take in
Right.
these qualitative sources, leverage generative AI models in particular for those to be able to analyze the ontologies and the nuances of the more scientific language that's encoded in these notes and be able to extract and make patterns from that. So that's almost like step one. And I think that's the big unlock that's happened over the last year and a half when it comes to technology. And then with that, if you layer on other, now you bring in predictive AI, which has been around for a while with more of the quantitative data. So take your claims diagnostics data. So now you can layer in quantitative data on top of this qualitative data that you used Gen AI for. And now, to your point, you can start to unlock different patterns, right? You could start to predict, am I seeing these kind of therapeutically aggregated claims and diagnostics gaps changing? And is there a correlation with what I'm seeing in my field notes and social media? And now you have this like dynamic living ecosystem of all of your sources in one place. And it is much more possible now than it was before because of Gen AI and because the unique characteristic of medical affairs data is that it's primarily unstructured. A lot of it is. I mean, outside of claims and diagnostics, right? You're looking at MSL field notes, surveys, feedback from HCPs or feedback from patient advocacy groups or social media or publications and research or Congress abstracts. Like none of that is really quantitative. In the publication, you might have graphs, that's
Right.
quantitative, but that's
Right.
about it. Like the rest is qualitative, right? So that's, I think, really just from a technological perspective, the shift that's happened to for now to be the time for there to be a shift that can really empower medical affairs teams to be able to tap into the full potential of what they have.
Absolutely, absolutely, and Viren, I think there's even more. There's even more to come because, as you rightly said, a lot at the moment is primarily text based, but you can think as well as starting to get information from images or videos. People like to post pictures or videos and facial recognition technology, and you can often tell pretty accurately, is normal function being restored, right? If somebody is on a
Mhm.
particular medicine or is on some kind of device. Are they being able to move around or walk not normally with some of the new sensory technology? But underpinning all that, you need things like Gen AI in the broader sense of the world to bring everything together.
Right. The connectors, you could have all of the data just like you do now, right? Medical
Right.
affairs has had all the data at their fingertips, so to speak, but it's a whole thing to analyze all of that data and
That's
bring it together and get value out of it. That's like a Mount Everest, I feel like sometimes across the board, not just in pharmaceuticals, but like a
absolutely,
Mount Everest to climb.
absolutely.
Well, so with that, this has been a really wonderful conversation. And with that, I just want to leave with another kind of tactical question and parting thoughts of, if you were to recommend a medical affairs team who that's really interested and excited to put the patient at the forefront and really try to have a different perspective and way of looking at measuring impact, whether it's with claims and diagnostics or treatment gaps of some sort in whatever way they want to or are able to measure it. What are the top 2 or 3 things that you would recommend that they can do today to get started?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing from a tactical uh, piece is identify that unmet medical need, right?
Right.
And it could be whichever one you want to focus on. Lack of diagnosis, you know, lack
Mm,
of diagnosis and treatment, adherence to treatment. Um, so whichever one of those, but I think identifying that unmet medical need is the first one, right? And then the leading from that is who are the right stakeholders we should be engaging with, right? And
right.
who are the ones handling and managing those patients. And the third one, I think, Vera, is embracing and being bold, right, to use these technologies.
Mm,
Like yours, they're not, to my mind, there's sometimes an existential concern that they may replace certain jobs or replace certain, right? But I think
right.
actually it makes those jobs and those people so much more robust because now you can leverage all of that and
Right.
really be impactful in that way.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's funny. I feel like in a lot of ways, especially if you're bold now and you're an early adopter, so to speak, of this technology, you're actually at the best advantage from a career perspective or an impact perspective because no one
That
else is using it. So even if it's just the selfish reason of like, I want to be competitive and like be be innovative in that capacity. But I think to your point, everyone should be using it because it's going to only enable patient outcomes. And that's what we're all here to ultimately do. And I think personally, AI will actually enable more jobs, as odd and counterintuitive as that might sound. They might look different, like the skill sets, but I think it's going to enable a lot more. So that's, the fear of, will AI take my job? I don't think it will. I do think people that use AI will take your job. So if that's not a motivator enough to learn, then I don't know what is.
No, that's absolutely right. And it's, if you keep that patient outcome, right, as that's the goal, everything
Yes,
else, whether it be the technology, whether it be the people or the behavior, right, as we're talking about, all
right.
those get you to that goal. They're not the ones that drive, right? You don't use technology for technology's sake. Use
Yes,
it for a purpose, right? And you use your people or other resources for a purpose. And it's the same with our own behaviors, right? We change our behaviors for a purpose. And I think as we're talking today, it's having that optimal patient outcome.
yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you, Eddie. I appreciate always having a conversation with you. So many thoughtful perspectives and frameworks, and you've explained everything so clearly. So thank you for coming on and chatting with us today.
Well, thank you, Vera. I enjoyed it thoroughly, and I love the technological discussions that we have as well, because I'm learn a lot from you all the time.
Oh, great. Well, we'll continue.